Welcome to today's webinar hosted by OraSure Technologies. I'm Jessica Polk of the Current Consulting Group, and I'll be conducting today's presentation entitled Drug and Alcohol Abuse Trends. We'd like to thank OraSure for hosting today's webinar. OraSure Technologies is a global leader in oral fluid substance abuse testing products. Their unique assays provide accurate and easy to administer testing methods to help determine the presence or absence of drugs or alcohol in a person's system. The Intercept Oral Fluid Drug Test is an FDA-cleared laboratory-based oral fluid drug testing system that enables accurate testing for 9 drugs of abuse, including marijuana, cocaine, PCP, amphetamines, methamphetamines, barbiturates, benzodiazepine, methadone, and opiates. Intercept is fast and easy to administer and is ideal for workplace, criminal justice, drug treatment centers, clinical setting screening programs, and more. Today's presentation qualifies for continuing education credit from SHRM, CCDAP, and from HIRCI for those who attend today's presentation in its entirety, and you will receive information following today's webinar on how to apply for those credits. Today's presenters are Bill Current from the Current Consulting Group and Jackie Perrone from OraSure Technologies. Jackie is the program leader for OraSure Technologies' Risk Assessment Division. She has 25 years of experience in the drug testing industry, working at OraSure for the past 10 years, and with Roche Diagnostic Corporation for 15 years prior to joining OraSure. She's responsible for the global direction, as well as the financial and market growth of the drugs of abuse and risk assessment product lines. With us today also is Bill Current. He is the author of Why Drug Testing, Updated and Expanded for 2020, as well as 9 other books of substance-related issues. He founded the Current Consulting Group in 1998, and it has become the #1 recognized name in compliance, business development, and operations consulting in the drug testing industry. And with that, I'm going to turn the virtual microphone over to Jackie to get us started.
Thank you so much, Jessica, and welcome to everyone that's attending today. We're excited actually to talk for the next 45-50 minutes or so about 3 specific areas. The first is going to be current trends in drug and alcohol use, and then we're going to transition to updates to drug and alcohol legislation. And then lastly, we're going to cover, is drug and alcohol testing relevant today? And I think this will go really towards a couple of different areas, which we'll cover really in the first 2 sections. And then there'll be some time for questions and answers after that. So with that, we'll start with the current trends in drug and alcohol use. So this first slide really talks about, this is the National Survey on Drug Use and Health. It comes out every year, and it looks at many different things, but one aspect it really looks at is past year illicit drug use among people aged 12 and older. And these are usually a year or 2 behind. So the latest data we have is from 2019. And so if you look all the way to the left, it really talks about, the pie talks about whether someone has used or not used an illicit drug in the past year. And so you'll see about 21% of the population, that's about 57 million people, have noted that they have used an illicit drug in the past year. If you then kind of look over to the right, you'll see what drugs those are. No surprise, marijuana is kind of in the lead there, and you'll see as we go through that that theme will continue. But then you'll also see kind of below that, what are some of the other drugs? So prescription pain reliever misuse, hallucinogens, and this will become a little more interesting too when we talk a little later about some of the legalization of mushrooms and some other things that kind of fall into this hallucinogen category. Prescription tranquilizers or sedatives, followed then by cocaine, stimulants, inhalants, methamphetamine, and heroin. So again, you can see by far and away marijuana is that top level. And you'll see here again, kind of looking at that illicit drug use and what that looks like kind of in a different landscape. So marijuana, again here, we've seen also a significant increase. Now remember, this was 2019 data. So from 2018 to 2019, we also had experienced a similar increase. And you'll see kind of year over year where we are with some of the other drugs. If you go to the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about marijuana specifically. And so use among adults age 26 or older increased from about 7% in 2002 to about 16% in 2019. And the reason that we're using some older dates is we're looking back to see some of the effects that legalization has had, whether that be medicinal or recreational. So you can see that, you know, it's more than doubled as a percentage increase from 2002 to 2019. Interesting to look at the perception of kind of that risk from harm from smoking marijuana. And so that has declined among adults ages 26 or older from about 38%, 39% in 2015 to about 31% in 2019. And probably not a surprise here either. We hear all the time when we're talking about legalization in certain states about, in the United States, kind of the general population and what the general population thinks about marijuana usage. And we know about 50%, maybe a little bit more, are in favor, generally in favor of the legalization of marijuana. Now that does also include medicinal as well as recreational, but clearly things have been tilting more towards the legalization and the approval of the general public and the use of the general public of these products over the years. We also know that new users of marijuana use increased among adults 26 or older from about 90,000 people in 2002 to almost 900,000 people in 2019. And again, this takes into account all of the years that we've been looking at the legalization of in most states, first medicinal and then moving on to recreational. A little bit later in the presentation, Bill is going to show the current map and what it looks like. And you'll see very few states where some sort of decriminalization or legalization is not legal. Most states have some sort of legalization. When we think about drug use in general, we talk a lot about marijuana, clearly, and it is the #1 most used drug out there in the United States. But we also have other drugs, and we know that we have had a lot of issues, and you've heard for the last few years, opioid overdose deaths. 2020 actually had the highest number of overdose deaths ever recorded in a 12-month period. And unfortunately, you know, this is, according to the CDC, drug overdose deaths rose nearly 30% in 2020 to a record 93,000 deaths. There were unfortunately, a number of milestones that went with that. Most drug overdoses in any year. Most deaths from opioid overdoses in any year that we've seen. Most overdose deaths from stimulants like methamphetamine, and most deaths from synthetic opioids, specifically known as fentanyl and some others. And just a quick story on fentanyl, as I was doing a little research. One of the reasons I think that people are thinking that we've seen more deaths and more use of fentanyl, and use typically equals death. I think we all know that fentanyl is a very, very potent drug. Fentanyl, up until a little bit ago, had really been focused primarily on the East Coast. And what we're seeing is that migrate west now. So we're seeing it in the Midwest, we're seeing it on the West Coast. So you're seeing more people have access to fentanyl as they had in the past. Fentanyl is also being mixed with other drugs. And, you know, again, fentanyl, once you take that, it's very difficult to regulate the dose, if you will. And fentanyl is the main driver of a lot of these overdoses. So what started, you know, years ago from an opiate perspective with some of the prescription opiate overdoses and oxycodone and things like that is really migrating, and we're starting to see that impact. And that's why, you know, unfortunately 2020 was one of the, you know, was the worst drug overdose year. Couple that with the pandemic, And people that do have a problem with opiates not being able to get to their clinic, not be able to, talk to people about treatment because the pandemic shut that down. That really, and you see in that last bullet, the New York Times has referred to the COVID-19 pandemic as a national relapse trigger. People were dealing with depression, they were dealing with, being locked down, they couldn't get to the help that they needed. So that compounded, a lot of the traditional opiate issues that we've had, and then add in the fentanyl issue that we're seeing now, and you can kind of start to understand where we were in 2020. When you look at, and these next two slides come from a specific drug testing facility, and they looked at the increase from 20, or the increase and or decrease in 2019 over to 2020. And again, not so dissimilar to what we're talking about here. You do see an increase in marijuana. You see a little bit of a decrease in cocaine, but you see a rapid and rampant increase in opioids and amphetamines. If you look at, the percentage, the number of positive random drug tests that are out there, this is the first time we've actually seen amphetamines surpass marijuana from a pure number of positive random drug tests. And again, we see that cocaine use has dropped, but it's dropped also in deference to amphetamines increasing. And as we see with amphetamines, number of positive tests by drug, 2017, 18, and 19. So you see the increase just in general, so from 2017 to 18 and 19 stayed about the same. But when you look at random testing by drug, and that's 2019 April to 2020 September, you see a huge differential here in random tests. So again, the type of testing you're doing also has an impact. And for those of you that, I know Quest every 6 months comes out with their drug testing index. It's a lot of information, but there's a lot of very good information within that. And while this information specifically didn't come from the Quest Index, that Quest Index definitely shows much of the same thing. And if you've not read it, the most recent version came out just a few weeks ago. Very, very interesting read. And they slice and dice the data very well. So you can really look at it from different drug testing types, different drugs themselves, geographical, as well as why you'd be testing pre-employment versus post-accident. So it's a really good read if you've not had a chance to do that. Positivity rates are rising. So positivity surged ahead in 2020 for marijuana across all specimen types. So again, when we think about, and that this is now referring to some of the Quest data, you think about how you're drug testing, what technology you're using, urine, oral fluid, hair. We see that positivity rate surging ahead for all three of those testing modalities. And it particularly surged in states with legal recreational laws, about 118% increase from 2012 to 2020. Again, not surprising, you have more access to marijuana. The overall positivity of drugs in the US workforce increased about 4% in 2020 and was 12.2% higher than in 2016. And again, when you think about when the bulk of states, I mean, we had some states out there, Colorado and some of the states on the West Coast that adopted a little bit earlier, but the bulk of states have really adopted their recreational marijuana, I would say, in the last 5 to 6 years. And so that's why, as you look at 2016, it's interesting to look at that date. And would not be remiss about talking about alcohol use. So we spent a little bit of time talking about drugs, but alcohol use as well is increasing. PTSD related substance abuse trends within the pandemic. So the Associated Press reported, and this was kind of back over a year ago when the lockdowns really first started, that the U.S. sales of alcoholic beverages rose 55% in the week ending March 21st. And if we remember kind of back to March of 2020 when everything started locking down, it was March 16th, 15th, 16th, 17th when that's when everybody said, okay, we're going to lock down, nobody should go anywhere. And this is basically the end of that first week. So that was kind of telling. Spirits like tequila, gin, pre-mixed cocktails led the way, sales jumping about 75% compared to the same period last year. Yet wine sales were up 66%, beer sales rose 42%. So clearly alcohol across the board was being used early on. And obviously online sales far outpaced in-store because a lot of stores were closed. 1 in 3 Americans are more likely to drink alcohol during working hours while working from home during lockdown. And so, these are numbers that came as we got further into the pandemic and, working from home, which for many of us continues. While some folks are going back to work, there are a number of folks that are still working from home either permanently or a good part of the week. If you look at kind of the breakdown between men and women, 36% of men and 26% of women said they are drinking on the clock. And so working from home, grab a beer at lunch, whatever it is. And while, these folks may not be in a physical production setting necessarily, they are probably in many cases reviewing documents, proofreading things. There could be financial statements they're looking at. So just because you're not physically in a production facility or in a distribution facility doesn't mean that, alcohol use while on the clock is not impactful. And then we also know that overall alcohol consumption was up 14% and heavy drinking was up about 19% according to one 2020 study. So the moral of the story here is we're seeing increases all across the board, both in alcohol as well as drugs, and in all different types of drugs, not just marijuana, which is typically what we would expect given the legal climate that we have in the United States. So we've got a poll. I'm going to hand it over to Jessica, and she's going to take us through this quick poll.
Great, thank you, Jackie. So do you think that drug positivity rates in the workplace will continue to rise in 2021? I'm going to go ahead and launch the poll and give you all an opportunity to participate. Your options are yes, drug positivity rates will increase in 2021. No, drug positivity rates will stay the same in 2021. Or no, drug positivity rates will decrease in 2021. And we'd like to hear your responses. We'll give you just another few seconds to participate. We always appreciate your participation and seeing what the home audience thinks. Okay, we're going to go ahead and close the survey. And I'm going to share the results. And so it looks like we're at about 78% said yes, drug positivity rates will increase in 2021. 19% said no, it would stay the same. And 4% thinks that it could decrease. Jackie, do you have any insight to share with us on this before we pass it over to Bill?
Yeah, and I think, from my perspective, we tend to think about the pandemic, right, being, it was COVID-19, but we saw the bulk of the pandemic in 2020. We kind of see what's happened in 2020 as far as these increases. But, it's not like we flipped a switch in 2021 on January 1st. We've still got a lot of people, as I mentioned, in, not going back to work or going back to work in various and different ways. We are still in and out of lockdowns in many cases. We've got the Delta variant that's now kind of traveling around the world. You've got a lot of people that are now a little concerned, a little more concerned perhaps than they were, say a few weeks ago. And so it's not surprising that we're seeing that percentage of people say that they will increase in 2021, because let's face it, we're not out of the woods yet. And so 2021 in many ways is shaping up to be similar to 2020. Yes, we have vaccines. Yes, we're seeing the economy, come back a little bit. but we're still not out of the woods yet. So yeah, not surprising to me that we saw the results that we did from the poll.
Thank you for that. And with that, we'll turn it over to Bill.
Okay, thank you both. Yeah, I guess that's pretty much what I was expecting as well from that poll. But it's concerning, you know, that we're all sort of expecting more positive drug test results in 2021, but it does coincide with this dramatic increase that we've seen in drug abuse over the last, say, 18 months or more, actually, when it comes to opioids. So we're going to spend a few minutes now talking about current trends in laws and legislation. I'm going to start out by showing you a map that shows sort of the current state of marijuana legalization in the United States. So the blue states are the ones that have legalized recreational or so-called adult use of marijuana. And the gray states, the lighter gray, are the states that have legalized medical marijuana. But it's important to note that all of the blue states, the states that have recreational marijuana laws, they already either had or at the same time legalized medical marijuana. So really what you can do as you look at the map is you can combine, in your mind anyways, the blue and the light gray states, and those are all the states that have legalized marijuana. The white states are the ones that haven't passed legislation yet. Some of those white states are actually in the process of reviewing legislation, debating it, and we do expect some more states to pass legal marijuana laws in 2021. In the dark section, that dark one right sort of in the middle to the right is Mississippi. Mississippi actually voted to legalize medical marijuana in 2020 during the national election, but then there was a technicality and the Mississippi State Supreme Court ruled that because of that technicality, it sort of vacated the vote of the public. So that's all sort of being worked out there. In a way, you could count Mississippi as a legal marijuana state because they voted for it. They're going to work that out, and then it's going to turn light gray on the map. But this is sort of where we stand right now when it comes to the sort of the state of the union, if you will. And one of the things that we've seen over the last few years is an increase in language in these marijuana laws that protects employees from various forms of discrimination or adverse employment action. And so that's been very common mostly in the medical marijuana laws, but we're also now starting to see it in some of the recreational marijuana laws. And by that what I mean is that a state will legalize marijuana, and then it will include specific language geared toward employers that prohibits them from discriminating against a registered medical marijuana user. So let's say, for example, somebody applies for a job and they announce that they're a registered medical marijuana user. In certain states, because of this language, this sort of anti-discrimination against legal marijuana users, an employer couldn't refuse to hire that person based entirely on that admission. Or somebody tests positive in a post-hire test and they test positive for marijuana, and as they're going through sort of that verification process, they let it be known that they're a registered medical marijuana user. The employer in many states would not be able to either deny employment or, in this second example, take any type of adverse employment action based on the positive test for marijuana if the individual can prove that they're a registered legal user of marijuana in that state. And I'm going to take you through a couple of examples coming up here in a couple of slides. But there's also some states that have included employer protection language that basically says that nothing in the law is intended to prohibit an employer from having some type of a drug-free workplace program in place, or even drug testing in a couple of state laws. And also very specifically, most of these laws do not prohibit, and in some cases actually say they don't prohibit, employers from not allowing employees to come to work with marijuana or to be at work while under the influence of marijuana. So the drug test maybe isn't proof that somebody's impaired on the job from using marijuana, but the state law allows the employer to prohibit the use of marijuana in the workplace, bringing marijuana into the workplace, or being under the influence of marijuana while on the job. And so not every state of, all the ones we looked at on that map have that employer protection language in it, but we see that in several states. And probably going forward, depending on where the state is in terms of its sort of political leanings, you would see that type of language included in some of the new legislation that will be passed in 2021. So let's look at this from just a few examples of various states. So back in November, during the general election, New Jersey voters voted to legalize recreational marijuana. New Jersey already had a legal medical marijuana law on the books, but they voted to legalize marijuana in recreational marijuana in New Jersey. But nothing in public question number 1, which was the name of the initiative that voters voted on, said anything about the workplace. Now, New Jersey's medical marijuana law has plenty to say about the workplace. So we sort of assumed that that would become the guidance for employers. But in 2021, legislators in New Jersey got together and actually passed 3 laws, which the governor signed, that have very specific guidance for employers in there, not unlike what I just talked about. But one very unique aspect is that it became the first state to require a impairment identification or recognition expert to make the determination whether somebody is impaired by marijuana on the job. Not unlike sort of the law enforcement officer who maybe is trained and certified in impairment recognition for roadside testing. And so this became the first state that implemented something like that, not the exact same thing, but something similar to it for the workplace. And we'll see how that works. Those positions didn't really exist for employment settings, and we don't know yet if other states are sort of going to follow that example. But it's an attempt on New Jersey's part to sort of work around this debate as to the use of a drug test result to indicate or to prove or to in some way claim that an individual was impaired because they tested positive. So we'll see how that plays out. New York legalized recreational marijuana this year, and Governor Cuomo signed that. So that's legal now. There is a little bit of workplace language in that. This is different than the New York City law, though, which is a city ordinance that prohibits pre-employment testing for marijuana within the city limits. As part of that New York City law, it's important to point out that there's a safety-sensitive carve-out. There's a long list of safety-sensitive positions that are exempt from that prohibition on pre-employment testing for marijuana. So don't confuse the new New York law for the state on recreational marijuana with New York City's ordinance that prohibits pre-employment testing for marijuana, except for certain safety-sensitive positions. New Mexico also legalized recreational marijuana. That's reflected in the chart. Alabama legalized medical marijuana. Montana passed a law giving guidance regarding recreational marijuana in the workplace. So Montana's law, this new one that from 2021, is important because it provides workplace related guidance, and that's important. And then one of the most recent new laws is Connecticut's legalization of recreational marijuana. So this was signed just recently, June 22nd. It's recreational marijuana. Connecticut already had a medical marijuana law on the books. And look at the second bullet. Employers cannot discharge or take any adverse action against an employer or applicant because the individual used cannabis products outside of the workplace before the individual was employed by the employer. This is a little bit unique, the way that they've worded it in Connecticut. I don't think it's a major departure from what we see in some of the more restrictive states like Illinois, for example, or Nevada. But it takes a slightly different twist that provides a certain level of protection for the legal user of marijuana. Now look on the right, you'll see some exceptions to that. Failing to, if by doing that, it caused an employer to lose a federal contract or federal funding, then the restrictions on drug testing in Connecticut would not apply. If the employer reasonably suspects an employee's use of cannabis while engaged in the performance of the employee's work responsibilities, here again, trying to make a connection between using marijuana legally outside of the workplace and possibly using it while at work or being under the influence. If you see in the third bullet, employee manifests specific articulable symptoms of drug impairment while working, that decreases their ability to perform their jobs. So here's where we're going to see sort of the next battleground when it comes to the legalization of marijuana. Can you make a connection between a drug test result, a positive drug test result for marijuana, and some other evidence that the individual was impaired or unable to reasonably do their job because of marijuana? So the drug test result may not scientifically or legally provide proof of impairment, but can a positive result be coupled with other manifestations in that individual's behavior? Maybe reckless behavior, increased and consistent tardiness or absenteeism, and other things, perhaps violent outbursts in the workplace, etc., to together make an argument that the individual was impaired on the job, maybe directly or indirectly the result of marijuana. So we'll see how that plays out. Again, the Connecticut law is new. Now, at the same time, we're seeing the criminalization of drug test cheating starting to advance a little bit. So early on, maybe 10, 15 years ago, we saw a few states make it illegal to quote unquote cheat on a drug test by using some type of synthetic urine or adding something to a urine sample. If you take a quick look on the internet, you'll find literally millions of websites, millions of hits of websites that offer to help an individual cheat on a drug test, but it's almost always a urine drug test. Now, urine testing is, the most common form of drug testing, although I'm going to share some statistics, or we will share some statistics that show the advancement of other testing methods like lab-based oral fluid. But it's always been highly susceptible to drug test cheating attempts, adding something to it or adulterating the sample or switching the sample with a purportedly clean sample from another source. And so Iowa passed a law that, as you see in the second bullet, a person shall not manufacture, market, sell, distribute, or use or possess synthetic urine or a urine additive for the purpose of defrauding a drug or alcohol test. And of course, efforts to subvert a drug test is very common. There's fairly high percentage of urine drug tests have been subject to some effort to subvert the test. And so we're starting to see slowly, not a huge advance like with the legalization of marijuana, but more states starting to pass laws that would do exactly what the Iowa law says. At the same time, now this is a new trend, but something that we've seen a little bit more, which is drug decriminalization. So during the national election in November of last year in Oregon, voters voted to essentially decriminalize all drugs, heroin, cocaine, as Jackie mentioned earlier, mushrooms, psilocybin, psychedelics, etc. It became the first state to do that. Now there's legislation in a few other states, California being one of them. California's been looking at doing this for a lot of years. It's never gained traction there. It might now that Oregon's done it, where they would legalize or really decriminalize, but de facto legalize all other drugs. And so we're starting to see some examples of that elsewhere. Also back in November, Washington, DC voters voted to decriminalize mushrooms. And so we're seeing a little bit of that. It's still very much in its infancy as a trend, but we're starting to see more of it, as you see an example from New Jersey there in the second bullet. And that really comes back to something that's very important to acknowledge, which is, as Jackie was talking about, while marijuana is a huge issue and a real headache in some ways for employers, it's not the only drug that people are abusing. Of course, as she talked about, we've seen a dramatic increase in opioid abuse, opioid fatalities from overdoses, etc. And as the decriminalization movement moves forward, we're probably going to see even more of that with synthetic opioids and other drugs that are sort of other than in that other than category from marijuana. So that's sort of the trend legislatively. We're seeing more legal marijuana laws in states that have legalized marijuana. We're also seeing new legislation to add language in there that protects the rights of the legal marijuana user. And in a few states, we're also seeing language being added to new legislation or retroactively to existing laws that would add language to protect the rights of employers, to prohibit employees from using marijuana in the workplace or being at work while under the influence of marijuana. So we'll talk a little bit more of the ramifications of that, but that leads us to our second poll, and I'll turn the time back over to Jessica to take us through that.
Thank you, Bill. So our second poll asks, do you think that decriminalization of drugs other than marijuana will increase? So let's go ahead and launch our poll, give you an opportunity to participate with us. Yes, drug decriminalization will increase. No, drug decriminalization will remain very limited, or I'm not sure. So if you want to just take a second to join us on this poll, we appreciate your input and your time sharing your thoughts with us. And we'll go ahead and just wait one more second. And we're going to go ahead and close the poll. And I'm going to share the responses. So it looks like 54% said yes, drug decriminalization will increase. 30% said no, and 16% said I'm not sure. So I'll go ahead and let Bill weigh in on these results.
Well, I have to agree with all three categories. I'm not sure either. As I said, it's sort of a new trend, and it'll be interesting to see where it goes. There's not a lot of it yet, but if you go back to the history of the legalization of drug effort, back in the 70s, it was always about all drugs. It was never just about marijuana. There wasn't really an appetite in the country for legalizing marijuana, or all other drugs at that time. You know, heroin was a problem, cocaine a big problem in the 80s. And so the effort really sort of began to focus on marijuana, and then really more so on medical marijuana, as sort of appealing to the compassion of the voter for people who suffer from various illnesses and diseases and whatnot. But now we're past that. We're seeing the legalization of marijuana spreading throughout the country, and now there's sort of a new effort to focus on other drugs as well. So it'll be interesting to see where that goes.
Okay, so that takes us into kind of our third section, which is drug and alcohol testing relevant? And I think, this poll question is a really good leading kind of discussion point for that, because I think a lot of us will say, well, okay, THC as an example, marijuana, we know there are issues with it depending on what testing methodology you're using. Why should I continue testing for it? At the same time, we're also seeing companies like Amazon deciding they're going to drop THC from their panel. And I know that we have over the past few years seen a few companies say, yeah, it's just not worth it to test anymore for a variety of reasons. They can't be sure when somebody actually ingested and whether they're still under the influence, if you will, at their job, or I can't find good employees. And so there are a lot of reasons why companies have started thinking about dropping marijuana specifically. But what was telling about that last poll question, and the reason we said it the way we did, not just marijuana, but other drugs, is because you really need to be thinking, from a relevant perspective, should we still be testing for any and all drugs? Should we be testing for alcohol when we suspect that somebody could be under the influence or using. And so what we're going to try to talk about over the next few minutes is, do we still feel that drug and alcohol testing is relevant? Marijuana and other drugs. So with that, I'm going to actually turn it back over to Bill, and he's got a few thoughts on this, and then he's going to turn it back to me, and we'll take this next section kind of as a tag team. But Bill, why don't you take us through your next slide?
Okay. So interestingly, and I was telling Jackie this earlier, that yesterday I had 2 separate phone calls with 2 different clients who were sort of talking about, what is the future of drug testing, and is this still a viable industry? Now, they were speaking about it from a business perspective, but they wanted to know my opinion. And I'll just tell you, I have a vested interest in this because I've been in this industry for over 30 years now. But I do believe, and I think there's a lot of evidence to support this, that drug testing is as important and relevant today as ever, maybe even more so, and that despite the legalization and some of the challenges to drug testing that we see in a number of states, drug testing is here to stay. Absolutely. I think the nature of drug testing will change over the next few years in some very dramatic ways, but drug testing is here to stay. This is what we know. We know, as we've talked about today, substance abuse, including marijuana, alcohol, and a host of other drugs, is up dramatically. We know that from a variety of sources. There's no disputing that. We also know from a couple of different companies that we cited in the first section of today's presentation that positive drug test results for workplace drug testing are also up dramatically. More substance abusers, more workers in the workplace testing positive. Tragically, that's leading to more accidents, some workplace related, some not workplace related, but traffic accidents and traffic fatalities related to marijuana are up. And in particular, they're up in states, the early legalization states like Colorado, for example. There's a lot of data on the increase in traffic fatalities related to marijuana in Colorado that tell us very specifically that as we sort of lower the bar and lower the barriers to use, and we remove the accountability factors, and we sort of make it easier to not only get the drugs, but to use the drugs because there just aren't any consequences for being impaired while driving a car, that unfortunately bad things are going to happen. So those are indisputable. We know that's happening. Drug use is up, positive tests in the workplace are up, and the tragic things that go along with it are up. Less drug testing means more users in the workplace, more workers under the influence while on the job, and more of the negative consequences that come with drug use in the workplace. Marijuana is a problem. Absolutely. It's a big problem, but it's not the only problem. As Jackie was talking about, we've seen dramatic increases in amphetamine abuse, opioids, alcohol, and very important for employers, right? When it comes to the workplace, the bottom line is always the bottom line. We're in business to make money, to keep our employees employed, and to provide a living for a lot of other people. So when it comes to considering, the bottom line, employers have to take into account other things that affect the bottom line, like their exposure to legal liability if they don't do things that reduce the possibility of tragic things happening as the result of workers being under the influence of drugs. So item number 3 refers to 2 doctrines of law, respondeat superior and negligent hiring laws. These are laws that hold employers responsible for the acts of their employees when they're functioning either within the scope of employment or outside of the scope of employment, depending on those 2 different doctrines, and they do something bad. So respondeat superior, for example, is a doctrine of law that says you, the employer, are responsible for that employee that you send out in a delivery van to make deliveries. If that individual is high on marijuana while operating your van, make deliveries on behalf of your company, in other words, he or she is functioning within the scope of their employment, you're responsible for their behavior. If they get in a car accident, your company can be held liable for that. If they cause an injury, property damage, or heaven forbid a fatality, which has happened, the employer can be held responsible for that. And think about that situation. something tragic happens and, you know, the lawyer representing the injured parties is going to go after the deepest pockets possible. And so if they can show that an employer should have known or could have known or could have done more to make sure that this worker, who's a longtime drug abuser, should not have been behind the wheel of a delivery van for the company, but they weren't doing anything really to prevent that. They weren't testing for marijuana. They weren't doing pre-employment screening for marijuana. Then that employer can be held responsible for that. And let me just say, on the subject of pre-employment testing, I've actually had people in the drug testing business tell me that pre-employment drug testing is dead, that the legalization of marijuana is going to kill pre-employment testing. I think that's really a very irresponsible thing to say, and something that is so far from the truth now. With the increase in substance abuse, the importance of pre-employment drug testing is perhaps more important than it's ever been. And so there are a lot of reasons to continue testing to continue drug testing and testing for marijuana and conducting pre-employment tests. And I'm just going to put this up for just a few seconds. These are 10 points from an article that OraSure Technologies published on reasons why companies should continue drug testing. And some of these we've talked about. We're not going to go into all of them. We're not going to pause on each one of them right now. But if you'd like a copy of this article, just let Jessica know after the webinar's over, or send her a message now. Let her know where you want the article sent to, and OraSure will send the article to you. But these are 10 points that are made in the article, but the article goes into detail on each one of them. Probably one of the most, I think, interesting aspects of why employers can continue drug testing is the fact that there are many different ways to do drug testing today. When I first got into this business back in the late 1980s, there was lab-based urine testing, and that was basically it. And it became the drug testing method of choice. It was the only method allowed under the SAMHSA guidelines for DOT testing, et cetera. But now a lot has changed since then. Back in October of 2019, for example, SAMHSA issued, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, issued final guidelines for lab-based oral fluid testing for federal workplaces. And that changes the landscape of drug testing considerably, dramatically actually, in that it makes drug testing more flexible. It gives employers a lot of different options. And as you see, number 10, you know, oral fluid testing makes the sample collections easier. And the reason why that's sort of highlighted there is that as part of the preamble to the new oral fluid mandatory guidelines that SAMHSA put out, they listed all the reasons why they finally decided to do it. And chief among them were all the different ways in which a collection becomes easier because of oral fluid testing. And so that kind of launches us into a little bit of a few slides about oral fluid testing. Let me turn that back over to Jackie to talk about that.
Yep, thanks, Bill. And that actually is a really good introduction to this slide, which is there's really only 3 SAMHSA endorsed testing methodologies: hair, oral fluid, and urine. And really only one of them supports recent use detection, and that would be oral fluid. And I think many of you have probably been on some of our webinars before, where we typically show a kind of a window of detection chart, which really talks about how quickly drugs can get into your system, depending on what testing methodology that you're using, and how quickly they exit your system. And what we do know is, from a urine perspective, drugs take a few hours to metabolize, so you kind of miss that front end window. What could be happening in a very short amount of time after somebody has ingested a drug. And then depending on which drug you're using with urine, you'll typically be able to, to see that drug in the person's system for a number of days, 2 to 3 days. Or in the case of marijuana, it could be much longer than that, depending on the potency, the person, their metabolism, so on and so forth. And then with hair testing, it takes generally about 7 days, sometimes up to 10 days, for the hair follicle to grow long enough to actually see that there's drug incorporated there. So again, you're kind of going to miss that first window of recent use detection. And while hair testing certainly goes out for up to 90 days typically, and it's great from a long-term historical perspective, you do kind of miss that front end. And kind of the difference here is with oral fluid, within minutes of ingestion, you'll be able to pick up that use. And oral fluid does have a more defined end point where you're really only going to detect for a maximum of about 36 hours, maybe a little bit longer for marijuana. And so again, it's not going to show impairment necessarily, but it will give you a more defined window than either urine or hair testing as far as what's considered recent use detection. Because of that, we have seen, and this data comes from the Quest report, again, from the Drug Testing Index. So this is just Quest data. And so there's a lot of different labs out there that are actually using oral fluid tests, but in particular, this is just Quest data that they published. You'll see 2018, there were about 1.3 million oral fluid tests, 2019, 1.6 million, and in 2020, over 2 million oral fluid tests. So that does speak to the fact that oral fluid testing is beginning to, pick up a little bit. We're seeing more and more tests being done for oral fluid. And some of the reasons, and those of you who have been on webinars with us before, we talked to some of these, so I'll just kind of quickly move through. We talked about recent use, which is a great option for capturing recent marijuana use specifically. All the information Bill shared with you about all the states that currently have adopted recreational or medicinal marijuana use, and as we said, it's a pretty big list. It's a great option for checking on that. It's easy to administer. You can use it for telehealth or socially distanced collections. Socially distanced, who would have thought a year and a half ago that would even be a concern? But with COVID still continuing on through this year and probably in the foreseeable near-term future, we do need to be thinking about, how we can keep our employers and employees safe. So it's a great way. We like to think of it as kind of a donor-driven or minimal contact, where the donor essentially can take the oral fluid collection device out of the package, put it in their mouth, put it in the vial, use the chain of custody seal, and put it in the lab pack. And so all that can be done at a safe distance of 3 feet, 6 feet, whatever it is, wherever the person is, whether they're at an Occ Health clinic or they're at your facility or wherever. And telehealth is something that's, we're not really sure if telehealth is here to stay, but, with a number of people working remotely, telehealth is kind of a new option out there. So there's a number of apps that allow you to kind of view the person that's giving the sample to ensure that it's really them and not have to be physically in the room with them. Again, not, whether you're at an Occ Health clinic or whether you're, at your local workplace facility, but very, very easy to administer from a telehealth perspective. And then another aspect is reduced cheating. So one of the things that Bill talked about is, one of the states that, we have several states now that look at drug cheating, as a positive. Many employers consider drug cheating as a positive. And it's just much more difficult to cheat with an oral fluid test as it is specifically for a urine test, as an example. So for those reasons, and there are several others, but for those reasons, we are starting to see more people adopt oral fluid, ask about oral fluid testing. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Bill for this very last section. And he's going to talk a little bit about the employer drug testing survey results.
So every year, the Current Consulting Group does a survey of the drug testing industry, and I'm sure many people on today's call have participated in it. Incidentally, it goes out in a couple of weeks, and we hope that when you receive it, you'll participate. But we also do an employer survey that's geared just towards employers who are not in the drug testing industry. And so those results will be shared very soon, but we're going to give you a sneak peek at some of the results. And we want to thank OraSure, Abbott, Quest, and DISA for being our corporate sponsors this year. We couldn't do it without them. The 2020 Employer Drug Testing Survey results show, what drug testing specimens do you use in the workplace? And as you would expect, that tall blue bar there is lab-based urine. So that's still king of the hill. Next to it is, to the left is instant urine testing. Excuse me, to the right is instant oral fluid testing and lab-based oral fluid testing. And so a lot of companies indicating that they're using some form of oral fluid testing. It's important to note, though, that even though those percentages are lower than some of the other specimens, they're much higher than they were in previous years. And so we also asked the question, do you plan on adding any testing methodologies in the next 24 months? And right there in the middle, 5.5%, almost 5.6% of respondents said yes, oral fluid testing. And so some of those will be, sort of companies that add it to their urine testing program, and some of them will be switching to oral fluid testing. But it's not necessary to switch entirely if you want to take advantage of some of the pluses of urine testing while starting to experience and enjoy the advantages of oral fluid testing. And a lot of this is being driven by concerns that employers have about marijuana and its effect on safety in the workplace. So we asked that question as well. And if you look at that big slice of blue off to the right there, between 12 o'clock and 6 o'clock, basically on the dial, about 48% said that they are concerned about the effect of legalized marijuana on safety in the workplace, and 32% said they're slightly concerned. So if you look at those two, that's almost about 80% that are concerned about the impact of the legalization of marijuana on safety in the workplace. And then companies considering removing marijuana from their drug test panel in the next 12 months, the dark blue slice of the pie again are the ones who said yes, about 9%, but the majority saying no, or they're not sure yet, at 69 and 21% respectively. So those are just four questions from the survey, the first two dealing with the oral fluid issue and these two with marijuana. But the whole marijuana issue, I think, is one of the driving factors behind sort of a movement, a migration, if you will, toward oral fluid testing. Now, with that, let's go to our last poll question, Jessica.
All right, thank you. So do you plan on adding testing methodologies in the future? So we'll go ahead and launch our options here. Yes, we want to add oral fluid testing. Yes, we want to add hair testing. Yes, we want to add rapid testing. No, we do not plan on adding testing methodologies, not applicable. So we'll give you a few minutes or not minutes, a few more seconds to participate in this poll about your plans for the future of drug testing methodologies.
And let me just add for the audience here that we do have a lot of questions, and we realize we're running out of time. We may get to one or two of them, but we will get to all of them afterwards. We'll respond to every question by email, or if you'd like, you can call someone at OraSure or here at the Current Consulting Group, and we'll get to those. But we did get a lot of questions today, and we're running out of time. So go ahead, Jessica, give us the results.
All right. So our results are, I'll share those with you now. About 20% say yes, they want to add oral fluid testing. Not a lot of hair testing interest. Rapid testing had about 8%, 25% are staying where they're at, and there's about 48% where it's not applicable to the future of their plans at their workplace. So I'll let you, Bill, or Jackie go on and take this back.
Okay, so Jackie, we're sort of out of time, but we do have a couple of questions that maybe I could direct toward you for some quick responses. One is, why is it, you talked about it in reference to something you said earlier in the presentation, why is it important to focus on or use one of the 3 drug testing methods endorsed by SAMHSA?
So, I think from our perspective, having an oral fluid test and not being able to really help people within the federal government. We've heard so many people say we would love to be able to use oral fluid testing, but we can't. The feds say that we can't, or we really want to take a cue from what the feds are saying. And I think this goes as well for hair testing, right? So urine testing has been around for 40+ years, and that's the only alternative people have had. And I think it's important that the federal government, there's a lot of thought that goes into actually coming out with these guidelines and allowing for other methodologies, other testing methodologies, in this case, oral fluid and hair. And, I think it lends a lot of credibility that it has been, it's kind of like FDA clearance and approval. You really want something that's been tried and tested and kind of given the thumbs up. And so I think, people look at it from that perspective. I think it's really important to kind of take the lead from the scientists. For those of you that don't know the whole process, DTAB, which is the Drug Testing Advisory Board, is comprised of a number of scientists that research the science and the technology and the applicability behind different testing methodologies. And the HHS SAMHSA is not going to allow something that hasn't kind of passed the muster of the scientific community. So there's a big thumbs up from the scientific community on these new technologies, hair and oral fluid. So, I think that goes a long way to endorsing, if you will, and I say that in air quotes, but endorsing these two methodologies in addition to urine.
Okay, and we're cheating here a little bit. Let me squeeze one more question in. If a company removes marijuana from the drug test panel, will that eventually motivate them to test for marijuana again in the future, or will they kind of never test for marijuana again?
I think with everything else, there's ebbs and flows. And, from my perspective, we have actually seen customers that have eliminated marijuana from their panel and kind of come back around the other way. They have seen accidents increase. They have seen production decrease. They have seen people take more time off of work, and they've kind of gone back the other way. In some cases, they may not, they may look at it and say, well, we're not going to do pre-employment testing, but we're going to put it back in place for other things like random or for cause or post-accident or things like that. So I'm a true believer in just because you do something doesn't mean that you'll never do it again. I think circumstances certainly dictate what people do and don't do as the future lies. And I do think, there are people that may take it off their panel and never come back. But I do believe that there are others that will reconsider if they feel they have a need and a reason to do so.
Okay. And we're really out of time now. So let me turn it back over to Jessica to give us our outro here.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jackie and Bill, for that information and taking us through today's presentation. On behalf of OraSure Technologies, we hope that you found today's presentation informative and helpful. This presentation was recorded, and you will receive instructions informing you on how to access the recording via email. Additionally, this presentation qualifies for 1 professional development credit from SHRM, HRCI, and DAP for those who attended today's presentation in its entirety. If you have met that requirement, you will be emailed the activity ID so that you can apply for those credits. And as Bill mentioned previously, if you submitted a question that was not answered today, we will have a representative reach out to you. We want to thank you for your attendance today, and this concludes today's webinar.